Hey folks, this is Boz with Any Which Wargame. So today I'm going to do an episode that was actually suggested to me by somebody in the comments. Now I've trawled through the comments and I can't find it, so if this was your comment, I do apologize and get in touch and I will credit you, no worries. Somebody commented saying, hey, you should do a video where you have a tier list of all of the model lines that OPR have released. And I said, yeah, that's absolutely a great idea. Definitely stealing that. Thank you very much. And so here it is. A couple of things straight off the bat, a couple of kind of disclaimers, I suppose. So, as always, this is my opinion. And not everyone's going to agree with me, and that's absolutely fine. I wouldn't want to live in a world where we all agreed on everything anyway. Can you imagine how boring that'd be? And this is just going to be for a bit of fun. You know, don't read too much into anything that I say because I'm literally just going through them and giving my thoughts and opinions on it. And that being the case, sometimes some of the things that I say are going to be contradictory. There might be a faction that I like because it's so similar to what the 40k equivalent would be. And for the exact same reason with a different faction, I might say, well, I don't like this one because it's so similar to the equivalent 40k faction. You know, I'm a human. I'm under no obligation to be consistent. This is just my opinion. It's just for a bit of fun. These won't be listed in any particular order. I'm just kind of going through them as I see them on my screen, basically. So the tiers, we're going to have 4 of them. There's going to be the S tier, which is the tippity top. They're the ones that I think are just amazing. I love them. I print them. I use them. They're awesome. And then we're going to have the A tier armies that are good. They're just not my absolute favorites. And then we're going to have the B tier armies that are like, well, you know, they're okay. They won't be my favorites, and I'll have, you know, good reasons, hopefully, for putting them in that tier. And then we're going to have the F tier, which, you know, F for fail. They're the ones that, for whatever reason, and I'll try to explain it as I go along, of course, I just don't like. Maybe it's the model line themselves, maybe it's a couple of kind of models within the line that just make me go bleh, but yeah. So those are our 4 tiers: S tier, A tier, B tier, and F tier. Alright, so let's dive in. First up are the Jackals. Now, I like the Jackals as a faction. I think they're a very cool faction. I like their lore. I think it was a very cool idea that OPR had to kind of have these scavengers, you know, cobbling things together and getting out on the stars. And I really like their models for the most part. Right now I'm looking at the Great Beast, and there's a couple of different variations where there's a different weapon on top. And the detail's really cool. There's a lot for a good painter to really get into with this model. I am not a good painter. I paint to tabletop standard. I'm not a bad painter, it's just not my focus. But I can definitely see models like these and appreciate someone who likes to do every individual scale with a different sheen and all those little pouches and things. There's a lot to do here. The veterans on beasts are okay. They're pretty good. Their Mastodon model is gigantic. And yeah, it looks pretty cool. It looks kind of like a cobbled together Sorian Starhost type thing, I suppose. The trackers are really cool. I like their poses. I like, you know, all the little gubbins they've got to paint up. I like that they're still in tatters. They've got kind of bandages and these kind of loincloths hanging down that are a bit tattered, you know, kind of keeping with their whole aesthetic. Very much ditto the shaman. We've got a couple of different options there for heads and staffs. And yeah, I just overall really like this army. I think that it's a really solid entry as a faction and as a model line. Even the vultures have this kind of cobbled together look. You know, it looks like the feathers are kind of stitched onto the frame of the wings, and that's really quite cool. And yeah, these guys look like desert nomads. They look like scavengers. I think the design team at OPR really nailed this faction kind of as a whole. So for all those reasons, I think they're a pretty solid entry into the A tier. Alright, let's move on now to Eternal Dynasty, and that's another kind of original OPR faction. And I've got quite a lot of love for the original factions. I think if they leaned more into that kind of as a whole, it'd be a pretty cool thing. That's neither here nor there for this particular discussion. So, Eternal Dynasty, they're Japanese, samurai in space type thing. Their lore kind of backs that up as well. They make really good use of technology and AI with their Onis and everything, who are valued members of society, as I believe the law states. So the aesthetic they've gone for here, as I said, is very much kind of feudal Japanese samurai shogun era type thing. And their Titan really shows that, it can hold a giant katana or a big gun, and yeah, the helmet, it's very reminiscent of Shredder from the Ninja Turtles back in the day, and it's a really cool Japanese style aesthetic that I think they've nailed quite well. And of course there are the models that we can kind of see the faces of sometimes as well, so we go, oh wait, no, these are actually aliens, and they're an interesting take on what an alien might look like. They're obviously different from humans, they're humanoid, but yeah, I do like what they've done with Eternal Dynasty and kind of leaned into ground up design of, hey, this is our faction, what do we want it to look like? We've got influences from here and there, but they're influences rather than this is our version of that, which, we're going to get to a couple of those types a bit later on. So the scouts are really cool. They've got those kind of rice paddy hat type things. The whole Japanese feeling here is quite strong throughout. It's a really strong theme, and I really quite dig it. Same with models like the Royal Guard, just looking, very staunch, and their poses are quite dynamic, especially some of the Oni, like the Oni captain holding the katana. I think that's quite a dynamic pose and kind of gives an impression of motion and flow. The warriors, the aesthetic is what I like here. The actual poses for the warriors are nothing really special. They're just kind of general soldier poses. They're not bad by any standard. They're just standard. They make use of some really cool kind of drones and turrets. The drones are very reminiscent of 40k Tau drones. And, I'm sure they had a bit of inspiration from Tau when they were making Eternal Dynasty as well. OPR have yet to come out with their Dao Union model line, so that'll be very interesting to see how that goes in the future. The Oni themselves have some really cool poses as well, and yeah, very much kind of, Gundam anime style Japanese robots. And, they do have a couple of models that I don't think are particularly special or dynamic, like the Dynasty leader, the Sage, is just kind of whatever. Not bad, just not particularly interesting. Their tanks are really cool. They look exactly like Japanese warships, and it's just another fun way they're really leaning into the whole Far East Japanese aesthetic. Especially with other units like their ninjas. You gotta have ninjas if you're doing a Japanese army, of course. And yeah, they look like kind of techno ninjas. They've even got a ninja walker, which, yeah, looks a little bit goofy. It's got kind of big kind of flathead screw arms, and yeah, I still think it's pretty cool. So given how much I enjoy that kind of feudal Japanese aesthetic and how much I enjoy this kind of unique model line from OPR and the fact that most of the models do look really cool, I'm going to say that Eternal Dynasty are going to fall into that A tier as well. Next up, we've got Robot Legions. So, Robot Legions are pretty much a plug and play for Necrons. It's basically one of those armies that's similar to, but legally distinct from. And, they're not bad, I just don't find them particularly inspiring for the most part. The Wraith Shard, the Great Shard, does look very cool. It's one of the more kind of dynamic models in the range. And then you've got something like the Tri-Scorpions, which, I think a lot of this army does just kind of look like a cheap 40k knockoff, rather than doing anything particularly unique with it. Just your bog standard warriors, for example. Like I said, it's very much similar to, but legally distinct from. You look at these and you know exactly what they're trying to rip off. And, I say rip off here rather than is inspired by, because, we're calling a spade a spade. The Robot Lord Warden, again, isn't anything particularly special or unique. It's more of the same. The models themselves, I guess, they're a bit interesting, and from kind of a painter's perspective, they're covered in things like scratches and tatters, and I can see a person who enjoys really getting into the detail of painting being able to make some really good-looking models from these models. Going down the list, having a look at things like robot snakes, it's just more of the same. I know what they're supposed to be. They're just different enough that they won't get into any legal trouble for it. And again, things like some of these Robot Lord variations like the Technomancer, it's fine. I mean, the Technomancer even has quite a cool model, and, the way that it's sculpted, you can very much see that there's some wind blowing, and, the tattered remnants of a tabard or something are blowing in the wind and everything. It's just, yeah, it doesn't inspire me to go out and print a bunch of them and paint them up, because I may as well just do Necrons. And I think that's a prevailing theme throughout this faction, including things like their walkers and, annihilators and things like that. It's just a little too on the nose. Even the flesh tearers, they're almost a 1-for-1 apart from the body shape and the head shape for what their 40k equivalent is. And, I know that OPR can do a better job of porting over a 40k army than the Robot Legions. So that just kind of is what it is. So we're definitely not going for A tier, but I also don't know that they qualify for F tier either, because they aren't bad, I suppose. They're just kind of uninspiring, and I think that's going to put them pretty solidly in B tier. Next up, we have the Blessed Sisters. Now, the Blessed Sisters were the first faction that I got when I joined as a Tier 2 patron a couple of years ago. And I joined as a Tier 2 patron because of these models. So you remember the bit at the start of the video where I said, sometimes I'm going to like or dislike an army for exactly the same reason? Well, this is definitely one of those times. So I love this model line. And one of the reasons that I love it is because it's almost a 1-for-1 for 40k, but it does it better. I think these models just blow the Sisters of Battle models out of the water. I think they're beautiful models. I love the exosuits. I love the detail of them. I love that it's all very grimdark. It's quite a grimdark army, and not all of them are for this game called Grimdark Future. And yeah, the aesthetic here with all the religious iconography and, the filigree and the scroll work and everything, it's super duper grimdark. And yeah, I'm all about it. They've got dynamic poses for things like their big exosuits, and they've got really cool models for things like the novice sister, the witch, reading out of the holy text. There's obviously wind blowing, and there's candles with wax dripping, and skulls, and yeah, it's just super grimdark. And again, it's pretty much a 1-for-1 for the 40k equivalent, but like I said before, this does it better. This is almost the complete opposite of Robot Legions, in which the comparison is kind of uninspiring. I looked at these models and I went, I need to join this Patreon. I want these models. The options for the High Sister Superior are more of the same. It's just oodles and oodles of detail And, you've got a couple of different choices for heads and weapons and stuff. More choices in general for stuff like that would be nice. But with what we've got, you can make a very unique army, even using the same figures as another person making the exact same army. And again, the amount of detail here for a good painter, for a dedicated painter who enjoys painting, you can make some beautiful models. Even the bog standard warrior sisters are just covered in this detail and this kind of iconography. One of them's got a chalice hanging off her waist, and they've all got these kind of cross spikes and things. And yeah, the whole faction to me just really screams that the designers put a lot of work in. And I don't see that across all of them. And for whatever reason, they decided to go all out with the Blessed Sisters, and I'm really glad they did. I'll just give a few more examples before we move on, but the Biker Sisters, they've got a really cool pose, and they've got really cool bikes, and, I'm always a big fan of that. And, they can have spears on the bikes, and they've got those bolters, or whatever they're called, heavy rifles, I suppose. And, there's obviously the option to put your leader on a bike as well. Most factions have options to have your leader on some sort of vehicle or mount. And you got the Fanatic Bikers. They look really cool. They've got these massive chainswords and they've got these big kind of ropes all around their bikes. And, you can tell that they look like they're in motion. And they want to get in and they want to get stuck in. And yeah, I can't say enough good things about the models of this faction. It's S tier, absolutely S tier. And, while they might not play on the table as well as I think they should because of how cool their models look, that's not what we're talking about here. And so yeah, Blessed Sisters, S tier. Moving on now to the High Elf fleets. This was a faction that I was very much looking forward to the release of, and when they were released, it was a bit I mean, they kind of just look like elves, but in space, which may have been the aesthetic they were going for, but it doesn't really do a whole lot for me. I think this is one of those factions where I also don't see a lot of kind of dynamic poses in the models themselves either. A lot of them are just kind of a bit bland even to look at. Like, the protectors, they're just in these big gowns and they're just mostly standing there. The ancient commander, like the elven noble, he's just kind of there and pointing. The cape's moving about in some sort of wind. But yeah, I look at these models and I'm not really inspired to print them out and play with them because they just, for whatever reason, don't do it for me. I look at them and I think they just look a bit bland. So the acolytes, they're also just kind of standing there and pointing guns. One of them has like a foot on a rock, but doesn't really give a sense of motion the way that so many other models in so many other factions do. Like, we know the designers can do this well because they've proven it. So I don't know why the High Elf Fleet's army looks so flat-footed. It's the same sort of thing with the strikers. There's just not a whole lot of range of motion or anything like that. And yeah, it's hard not to compare them to things like the striking scorpions of 40k Eldar, which is what they're kind of modelled on. It's a very much an about face from the Blessed Sisters that I just talked about in terms of, yeah, I can kind of see what the one-to-ones are, but I think I like the other ones better. And I think that's basically what it comes down to with this faction. I think even some of the better looking ones, like the Elven Noble Stinger, the pose is kind of interesting and everything, but not interesting enough to make me go, I'd rather have these than Eldar. And High Elf fleets have a lot of models. It's a very kind of full and complete model line. I think some of them have more than others, and High Elf fleets definitely have a good range of models, but I just don't really find them particularly interesting or inspiring. And so for that reason, I'm going to put them in the B tier. Alright, let's get the Orc Marauders out of the way. I didn't want to save them for last because I didn't want to end on a sour note. I've made no secret of the fact in the past that I do not like these models at all. I think they're dumb. These models being released was the reason for putting my Patreon subscription down from tier 2 to tier 1. These are just silly. I think they're really just silly. And not like good silly, like wacky in the way that 40k orcs are. Just silly as in I don't really get what they were going for. They've got big bald heads and pointy ears, and they're big and they're muscly, and they somehow managed to make that combination look really bland. They stick a couple of feathers on them here and there to emphasize that they're tribal, because nothing says tribal like feathers, apparently. They've got this kind of, I don't know, primitive style body armor on them. I'm looking at the Orc Warriors right now, and yeah, I guess the best I can say for them is they do look better after the redesign than they did before the redesign, when they basically just looked like chunky guardsmen. But yeah, Orc Marauders for me is a massive swing and a miss. The aesthetic that they've gone for is just kind of, I don't know, tribal blandness. There's nothing about them that makes me think that they're a unique take on anything. You know, they're obviously not 40k orcs, and you know, Tano is very vocal about, I don't want to do 40k orcs, these are OPR orcs, and you know, I get that, I respect that, but what they've come out with instead is some sort of mix of kind of Warcraft style orcs in space with this kind of weird tribal vibe, and you know, they're supposed to be this kind of really together art. You know, they're not kind of wacky like 40k orcs are or anything, and you know, things aren't cobbled together in the same way or anything like that. But they've just managed to come out with stuff that I just think is kind of nothing. That might be a bit harsh, but this is just one person's opinion, and yeah, this is definitely my opinion. Their trucks don't look like anything special. Again, they just kind of look like, you know, Human Defense Force APCs, but don't forget they've stuck feathers on them to make them tribal. I see feathers on the exhaust pipe, I see feathers on the front, there's even a skull there, and you know, it's just, look, I don't want to go on about it because I haven't got haven't got the time. I don't want to go on about it. I'm just going to say that for all the reasons I've listed and more, this is F tier. And we're going to move right along to the Sorian Starhost. So I love their take on lizard people in space. I think it was a real fumble that Games Workshop have never come out with their own version of their lizard men in space. And yeah, OPR really stepped into that void in this particular instance and came out with something that I think is just really, really cool. It's basically everything that's in the fantasy line, but kind of the technology's moved forward and now they're in space. Things like the chameleons, you know, you can see their kind of fantasy roots, but the way that they've updated them for sci-fi, I think, makes sense aesthetically, and it is interesting. I also think that the models themselves have really cool poses. Like these chameleons, they're standing on branches, and they're kind of leaning out and using their tails for balance, and it's just, yeah, it's another really, really big hit for the design team. Their use of kind of dinosaurs is really cool as well to see updated to kind of the spacefaring age. Like the Sorian veteran on Raptor is really cool. You know, that Raptor's moving, it's running, and this thing this veteran riding it. The sense of being in motion is very much alive in this faction. Similarly, the geckos on the pterodactyls, or whatever they're officially called, they might be pterodactyls. Again, the sense of motion is really clear, and the sense of, okay, it's not just we've cobbled together a bunch of space stuff and chucked them on them. It kind of looks like you can see how they've gotten to where they are from their fantasy roots, and how they've kind of stayed true to those roots in their kind of aesthetic with their big headdresses and iconography and everything like that. But also just, they fit right into this spacefaring society. They're not all hits. Things like the Gecko Champion Carmelian, it's a bit of a bland one. The poses are nothing special at all. But then you've got a model like the Gecko Champion on the Palanquin, the Priest, the Starseer, and again, even though there's not much actual movement going on with the model, you can really see, okay, this is one of their priests and they're meditating or doing something, and the model is interesting. It's kind of hard to explain, but it doesn't look like it's just some dude sitting there thinking. The Ankylosaur, I think, is a really cool tank unit again. And I love, again, just that they've really stayed true to their kind of fantasy roots, and they don't really have vehicles and such. They just use dinosaurs for stuff. You need a tank, use an ankylosaur. You need a flyer, use a pterodactyl. You need something to rip stuff up, use a tyrannosaurus. It's something that I just really like about this faction, and I've said it a couple of times now, the fact that they just really don't feel like a cobbled together space version of the Sorians. They feel like Sorians moved through time, over time, and got to where they are, and this is what they are now. Anyway, I love this faction. I think I've spent enough time talking about it. This is another one of my S-tier factions. Just for the range of the models, the dynamic poses in the models, and the fact that I think a good painter could really go to town on some of these models and come up with something special. Alright, we're going to talk about alien hives now. So this is another one of those factions that unfortunately I think is just quite bland in being its 1-for-1 40k equivalent. I don't think this is a particularly interesting take on Tyranids, and it's definitely a similar to but legally distinct from Tyranid's army. It's not that I think the models are bad, the way that I do with the Orc Marauders models. I'm looking at the Grasper Titan now, and yeah, it's dynamically posed, there's a lot going on. For whatever reason, I just don't really gel with this take on Tyranids. There's almost nothing about it that screams, I am my own army, I am my own thing. And they had 2 chances to do this. Alien Hives are one of their factions that got kind of re-released and updated, so I would have expected and hoped there to have been a bit more of a unique take on what this kind of Tyranid-esque faction would look like in their universe. Now, their lore is a different story, but we're not talking about their lore, we're talking about their models. The kind of big, chunky, beastie style isn't one that I like very much. I guess my issue mainly with this faction is that I spend pretty much all my time looking at it, comparing it to the Tyranids, instead of being able to just see it for its own thing. And whether that's a failing of mine or whether that's a failing of the model design is very much debatable, but, as it is, that's pretty much my thoughts on Alien Hives. I could go through a few more models and kind of give you a few more examples of why I think that, or we could just kind of move on. Yeah, I don't really need to say that Synapse Beasts look so much like their 40k equivalent. I'm surprised that OPR got away with it. We can just put it down, we can say this is another one of my F-tier factions, and we can just move right along. Right, well, we're down to our last couple now, so we're going to have a look at the Dwarf Guilds. Now, I don't want to say that these came out pretty much the same time as the Leagues of Votann did, because, frankly, I can't be bothered to look up and see whether it's accurate or not, so I guess all I'll really say is it felt like, to me, it was a very similar timed release. And I actually don't know enough about Leagues of Votann to say with any degree of certainty what's a one-to-one kind of equivalent and what's not. So I'm just going to ignore that aspect completely and just say these aren't a bad take on dwarves in space. I just don't particularly like them. They're a bit blocky. I'm sure they're supposed to be. They're dwarves and everything. But yeah, to me, they just look a bit blocky and not really my cup of tea. There's not really a whole lot to say about them, other than that I just don't really like them. I think a lot of their poses are quite boring, especially compared to some of these other factions that we've looked at. For example, the Dwarf Warriors, they're just kind of standing there. One of them's got like half a foot raised, and the other ones are just kind of standing there holding guns. And again, design team, we know that you can do this well. You've proven it so many times. And yeah, this one was just a swing and a miss as far as I'm concerned. The Dwarf Champion isn't particularly interesting either. You've got a couple of different options for, do you want a hammer or a sword? Are they young or are they old? But yeah, it's basically just I'm standing here holding a gun and a hammer or a sword, and I'm kind of standing on a rock and looking off into the distance. You know, there's not much interest in the pose. There's not really much to say about the model itself. I don't like the blockiness. Their vehicles are kind of interesting, I suppose. You know, they're tracked vehicles, and I guess they're kind of based on mining vehicles, you know, seeing as they're dwarfs and everything. Again, their tanks look a little bit like Human Defense Force APCs, much like the Orc Marauders ones did. They're just nothing particularly special. This is definitely one of those big personal taste things, I think. I don't like the aesthetic of the Dwarf Guilds at all. I think they're too blocky. I think they're too kind of boring in their poses. That's about as much as I'm going to engage with them. I'm going to put them in B tier. You know, they're not the worst, but they're definitely nothing special as far as I'm concerned. Last but not least, we've got the Human Defense Force to look at. So I was really excited for this release. I was looking forward to it for ages before, you know, long before it was actually announced. I was just really looking forward to OPR's take on squishy humans, on Imperial Guard, on, you know, just your bog standard human force. And that's because that's the faction that I primarily like to play. I like to play squishy humans who don't have all these powers and abilities and things, who are just trying to make their way in a galaxy full of aliens and monsters who are just ridiculously more powerful than them. I think it's really cool storytelling to be the underdog squishy human. So yeah, I was really looking forward to the Human Defense Force release, and I wasn't disappointed. We got an interesting take on what humans look like. They are very different from Imperial Guard in kind of the way that they look, in their uniforms and everything like that. They're different enough that they are definitely their own thing. OPR said, we're doing our own take on humans, and they did, and I think they got it right. It's nothing particularly special or groundbreaking, but it's definitely unique in a way that isn't a fail. You know, their tanks look good. I think they're different enough from Imperial Guard stuff to definitely be their own thing. Again, they're nothing earth-shattering, but they are different and they are unique. And that's kind of the theme of this army as a whole, is that they've very much taken their inspiration from 40k and Imperial Guard and very much put their own spin on it in a way that I think is just cool. I really like that they've utilized autonomous robots for things like, you know, grunts and ogres and things like that. I know that a lot of people are missing Ogren from the list and ratlings and things like that, and I totally get that. But on the other hand, I do think that the inclusion of all these different forms of robots are actually quite cool. I think it makes sense for this kind of setting for that to be the case, you know. The reason that they don't have things like that in 40k is because there's this big human thing against AI and blah, 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 blah. But of course, this isn't 40k, so yes, we can have robots that do a lot of the fighting for us. And I think that was just a really cool thing to lean into, and yeah, I like a lot of the company leader models. You know, some are obviously better than others. It's not a perfect release by any standard, but it was one of those releases, like I said, that I was looking forward to, and when it dropped, I wasn't disappointed. I was really impressed with their take on something that is very well ingrained. And for that reason, I'm going to put this solidly in the A tier. So that's it. That's all of the factions that have been released on My Mini Factory so far. From the bottom, in the F tier, we've got the Orc Marauders and the Alien Hives. In the B tier, we've got Robot Legions, High Elf Fleets, and Dwarf Guilds. In the A tier, we've got Jackals, Eternal Dynasty, and Human Defense Force. And right up in the S tier, we've got Blessed Sisters and Saurian Star Host. So that's my take on the models that One Page Rules have released for their sci-fi game so far. What do you think? What do you agree with? What do you disagree with? Let me know in the comments below. I really appreciate the fact that the comment section is a place for lively discussion and debate, and that I haven't really seen any toxicity in there, and that's just awesome. I'm really glad that the people watching this and commenting are engaging with it as much as you all are. You know, I'm up over 200 subscribers now, and I appreciate the hell out of that. So let me know what you think. Comment, like, subscribe, do all those wonderful good things, and I will see you next time. And until then, let's roll some dice.